The unfair dismissal. John Matthews entered Harris Industries that morning with the same quiet determination that had carried him through a decade of hard work and dedication. His desk, a modest setup tucked away near a large window, was organized with a careful attention to detail. The sight of neatly stacked papers, a laptop humming gently, and a framed photo of his family served as small, comforting reminders of the life he built outside the office. His routine was simple but fulfilling. Come in early, work diligently, and contribute to the company he'd grown to respect. But today, the atmosphere felt off, an unfamiliar tension hovering in the air like a storm brewing. Across the room, David Harris, the white manager known for his ambitious yet sometimes ruthless approach, was pacing in his office, glancing periodically at John's workspace. David had joined the company a few years ago, ascending the ranks with speed, thanks to his strategic mind and cutthroat demeanor. While John respected his manager's drive, he'd often felt a subtle, uneasy friction in David's attitude toward him, as if every interaction was weighed down by something unspoken. Today, that feeling was amplified. John could sense David's gaze on him, like a hawk watching its prey, and he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the project due by the end of the week. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard was usually a source of calm, but now each keystroke seemed to echo ominously in the silence. It was unusual for the office to be this quiet, even at this early hour. John wondered if his colleagues had picked up on the manager's restlessness and were deliberately keeping their distance. The tranquility shattered as David strode across the room, his heavy footsteps growing louder. Without so much as a greeting, he called out, "John, we need to talk." His tone left no room for delay or refusal. John's stomach twisted into a knot as he rose from his chair, the weight of a decade's worth of hard work suddenly feeling as fragile as glass. Every step toward David's office felt heavier than the last, and the distance seemed to stretch like a hallway in a nightmare. He could feel the eyes of his few coworkers still in the office on him, the murmur of whispers adding to his unease. By the time he reached David's office door, his palms were slick with nervous sweat. David closed the door behind them, his expression hard and unyielding as he motioned for John to sit. The room was sterile, cold, with minimal decorations, a perfect match for its occupant. David sat across from him, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, radiating a barely contained impatience. John forced himself to sit upright, determined to meet whatever was about to come with as much composure as he could muster. "John," David began, his voice sharp and direct, "I've reviewed your performance, and frankly, it's not where it needs to be." The words hit John like a slap. Performance. He thought back over the countless late nights, the missed family gatherings, the weekends sacrificed for work. His track record was spotless, and he had always taken pride in his dedication. His mind scrambled to understand. But David didn't give him a chance to respond before launching into a litany of vague accusations. "There have been complaints, concerns that your work has been falling short," David continued, leaning forward with an intensity that made John's skin crawl. "The company has standards, John, high standards, and unfortunately, I don't think you're meeting them anymore." John's breath caught in his throat. "Complaints? I haven't been informed of any issues, David," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I'm constantly making deadlines, double-checking my work, and even stepping in on projects when others need help. I've never been told there was a problem." David dismissed his protest with a wave of his hand, the impatience on his face shifting into something that resembled contempt. "Sometimes, John, it's not just about meeting deadlines. It's about the way things are done. The quality, the enthusiasm, the fit with the company culture." The fit with the company culture line felt like a punch to the gut. John had heard that phrase used as a polite euphemism to justify discrimination or bias. But he couldn't believe that, after all this time, it would apply to him. He thought he'd proven his value, that his work spoke for itself. And yet, here he was, being told he no longer belonged. "David, I have put my heart and soul into this job," John said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to contain. "If there were issues, if my performance wasn't up to par, I deserved to know about it so I could improve. But blindsiding me with a decision like this, it's not right." David's gaze hardened, a flicker of annoyance passing over his features. "This isn't personal, John. It's business," he replied, the phrase dripping with finality. "I've made my decision. You'll find a severance package waiting in HR. I think it's best you clear out your things by the end of the day." John felt his world collapse around him. The years of loyalty, the sacrifices, the friendships forged over late nights and early mornings, all reduced to a polite dismissal and a severance check. Anger surged through him, fighting with the disbelief and the pain. "David," he said, his voice trembling with a quiet but fierce anger, "you can't just fire someone without a reason. This isn't just an issue of business. It's discrimination." David raised an eyebrow, his face hardening further. "Be careful with accusations like that, John. The decision has been made, and it's final. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." The dismissal was clear, sharp as a knife. Feeling like he'd been physically struck, John rose slowly, the weight of David's words pressing down on him like a crushing burden. As he left the office, he felt as if he were stepping off a cliff, his secure world suddenly disintegrating into uncertainty. Back at his desk, John's gaze drifted over the personal items he'd collected over the years. A framed photo of him and his brother, Richard, on a hiking trip, a coffee mug given to him by a colleague on his 5th work anniversary, and a small stack of certificates of recognition from the company. They all seemed so meaningless now, relics of a time that felt like it belonged to someone else. The room was quiet again, almost oppressively so. Colleagues glanced over at him, their expressions a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Some had undoubtedly heard what had happened, but no one dared speak. The realization hit John like a cold wave. He was alone in this fight, and his life was about to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he packed his belongings, a single thought began to crystallize in his mind. This wasn't over. David may have been able to wield his power here, but John wasn't as alone as he felt. His brother, Richard, the mayor of the city, would need to know what had happened. Not because of their bond as siblings, but because what had happened today was an injustice that went beyond him. And if there was one thing Richard believed in, it was standing up against injustice, no matter the cost. With a newfound resolve, John took one last look at the office he'd given so much to and walked out, leaving behind the job he'd dedicated his life to, but carrying with him a determination that no one could take away. This was just the beginning. A brother's bond. John Matthews sat across from his brother, Mayor Richard Matthews, at the long oak table in Richard's dimly lit dining room. It was usually a place of laughter and warmth, where family dinners stretched late into the night. But tonight felt different. The clinking of silverware and the quiet hum of the city outside were the only sounds filling the silence. John, normally talkative and lighthearted, had barely spoken a word since arriving, and Richard's keen sense for reading people told him something was weighing heavily on his younger brother. "John," Richard began, breaking the silence, his voice laced with concern. "You've been quiet all night. What's on your mind?" And stared down at his plate, pushing the food around with his fork. He hesitated, feeling a flood of emotions well up. Anger, disbelief, hurt. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting Richard's. "Rich," he said quietly, "I was fired today." The words hung in the air, settling over them like a cloud. Richard's usually calm expression shifted, his brows knitting together in surprise. "Fired? You?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "After all those years at Harris Industries?" John nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the day return. "Yeah, I thought I was doing everything right. You know how hard I've worked, how much I sacrificed for that job. But today, David Harris called me into his office and told me I wasn't meeting expectations, said there were complaints about my performance. John's voice quivered as he spoke, the injustice of it still raw. Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he processed what John was saying. Complaints? From who? And since when? That doesn't sound like you at all, John. John let out a bitter laugh. Exactly. I've never heard a word about any complaints until today. I always thought my work spoke for itself, you know. But he didn't even give me a chance to defend myself. Just told me to collect my things and go. It was humiliating. Rich. Richard's expression darkened as he listened. He had dealt with people like David Harris before, those who wielded power over others as if it was their right, their privilege. But hearing that someone had treated his own brother this way, after all John had done for that company, stirred a deep sense of anger within him. I don't get it, John. Why now? You've been with them for a decade. What changed? Richard's voice held a note of suspicion, his mind racing to connect the dots. John hesitated, glancing down again, his jaw clenched tightly. I think it's because of who I am. Because I'm black. I could see it in his eyes. The way he looked at me. It wasn't just about my work. I've seen that look before. Like I didn't belong there. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the shared understanding of experiences that Richard and John had faced throughout their lives. As mayor, Richard had fought against systemic injustices for years, knowing how often his community was marginalized, silenced, or dismissed. But this was personal. John, if this is about discrimination, then we're not letting this go, Richard said firmly, his voice low but steady. This isn't just about your job. It's about holding people like David Harris accountable. You deserve justice. John nodded slowly, appreciating his brother's determination, but a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Rich, I don't want to be some symbol. I just want my job back. I want to be treated fairly, like anyone else. Do you think going after them will change anything? Richard reached across the table, resting a reassuring hand on John's shoulder. Sometimes change comes because someone stands up when it's hardest to do so. You have every right to fight this, not just for you, but for anyone else who's been pushed aside because of who they are. I can help you, John. We can make a difference. The thought lingered between them, the unspoken memories of their childhood flashing in both their minds. They had grown up in a world where they had to fight for their place, to prove their worth over and over again. John had worked tirelessly to carve out his path, to rise above expectations and create a life defined by his own achievements. And now it felt like all of that had been stolen from him in a single unjust decision. After a long pause, John sighed, a flicker of resolve sparking in his eyes. All right, he said quietly. If you think we can make a difference, then I'm in. But how do we even start? Richard smiled, his gaze steady and reassuring. We start by gathering every piece of evidence we can find. Emails, reports, any communication you've had with him or others at the company. If there's even a shred of proof that your dismissal was unjust, we're going to find it. John nodded, feeling a sense of purpose replace his despair. As he sat there, surrounded by his brother's unwavering support, he realized he wasn't alone in this fight. He had someone who believed in him, someone who wouldn't rest until justice was served. Over the next few days, John and Richard worked tirelessly, combing through files, messages, and performance reviews. They reached out to former employees who had also left Harris Industries under suspicious circumstances, quietly gathering a network of people willing to share their own stories. With each conversation, it became clear that John's experience was not isolated. A pattern of discrimination and unfair treatment began to emerge, painting a damning picture of Harris Industries and its practices. As John sat in his small apartment late one night, flipping through a series of documents, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The anger he had once felt had transformed into a quiet resolve, a determination to ensure that no one else would have to face the same injustice. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that he would likely face opposition and doubt. But with his brother by his side, he felt ready. Meanwhile, Richard, with his position as mayor, began quietly rallying support from local organizations and activists. He knew that going up against a corporation like Harris Industries would be no easy task, but he also knew that the community stood behind him. In hushed conversations and late-night meetings, he forged alliances, bringing together people who believed in the same cause. By the time John and Richard had finished gathering their evidence, their plan was clear. They would file a formal complaint, demanding a public investigation into Harris Industries' hiring and firing practices. And should it become necessary, they were prepared to take their fight to court. The brothers sat together once more in Richard's dining room, surrounded by stacks of documents and notes. John looked at the pile, a mixture of exhaustion and determination in his eyes. "Do you really think we can win this, Rich?" Richard smiled, his gaze unwavering. "I believe in you, John, and I believe that people deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who they are. This isn't just a fight for justice. It's a fight for what's right. And if we stand together, I have no doubt that we can make a difference." John felt a surge of gratitude and pride for his brother, the man who had dedicated his life to serving the community and now stood ready to fight for him. He knew that the battle ahead would be long and challenging, but he was no longer afraid. Together, they would face whatever came their way, armed with truth, resilience, and a shared commitment to justice. As they shook hands across the table, a silent pact formed between them. No matter how hard it got, no matter what obstacles stood in their way, they would see this fight through to the end. They were not just brothers. They were allies in a battle for justice, a battle that would change their lives, and the lives of many others, forever. Seeds of justice. The next morning, John woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The sting of being unjustly fired was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was joined by a determination he hadn't felt in years. His brother, Richard, had made it clear that they were going to fight this together, and for the first time since leaving David's office, John felt hopeful. John spent the day combing through his files, gathering performance reviews, old emails, and any documentation that could support his case. He sifted through project reports, time-stamped files, and quarterly feedback sessions, his eyes meticulously scanning for anything that might prove his dedication and professionalism. Every paper, every line of text felt like a small piece of the story he was about to tell, a story of a loyal employee whose commitment was undeniable, who had been pushed aside because of factors far beyond his work. Late in the afternoon, John took a break, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his tired eyes. His small apartment was filled with piles of papers, his laptop buzzing with saved emails, and a notebook packed with reminders of every late night he had spent at Harris Industries, working tirelessly to meet deadlines. He had invested years into that company, and now all those memories felt bittersweet. But as painful as it was, each memory strengthened his resolve to see this battle through. Meanwhile, Richard was hard at work behind the scenes. As mayor, he had the influence and connections to set things in motion, and he wasn't going to waste any time. Richard reached out to trusted contacts in the city council, colleagues who were advocates for workers' rights, and even a few local journalists who had covered social justice stories in the past. His goal was clear: to ensure that this wasn't just about John's experience, but about the broader issue of discrimination and injustice in the workplace. In one of his meetings, Richard sat across from Linda Rice, a well-known local journalist who had covered issues of social justice and systemic bias for over a decade. Her newspaper, the City Sentinel, was widely respected, especially among the community, for its willingness to challenge authority and expose hidden injustices. "I appreciate you meeting with me on such short notice, Linda," Richard began, his tone serious. "I want to bring something to your attention, but it needs to be handled carefully." Linda leaned forward, intrigued. "If it's important enough for you to reach out directly, Richard, I'm all ears. What's going on?" Richard took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "It's about my brother, John. He's been fired from Harris Industries, under circumstances that, well, let's just say they don't add up. There's no justifiable reason for his termination. He's been with them for years, has an exemplary record, and suddenly, he's being told his work isn't up to par. It doesn't sit right. Linda's expression hardened as she took in Richard's words. "Do you suspect discrimination?" Richard nodded slowly. "More than suspect. I believe it's exactly what happened. And I'm not just saying that as his brother. I'm saying it as someone who's seen this sort of thing too many times before." Linda took a moment to process, her mind already racing through potential angles for the story. "If what you're saying is true, then this could be bigger than just your brother. There might be other employees with similar stories. Are you sure John is ready for this kind of exposure?" "He knows what's at stake, and he's ready," Richard replied confidently. "This isn't just about getting his job back. It's about making sure no one else goes through what he did." Linda gave a resolute nod. "I'll look into it. If there's a pattern of discrimination, we'll find it. And once we do, we'll make sure everyone in the city knows about it." With that, Richard left the meeting feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that once Linda and the city sentinel were involved, Harris Industries would find it hard to keep this matter under wraps. Their influence was powerful, and the public would be watching closely. But Richard wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, he continued reaching out to former Harris Industries employees, people he believed might have faced similar treatment. One by one, they came forward, some cautiously, others with stories of their own frustrations and challenges. Each story painted a broader picture of a company with a culture that often seemed dismissive of its minority employees. In his small apartment, John was meeting with an unexpected ally. Marcus Taylor, a former employee of Harris Industries who had been let go a few months earlier under equally questionable circumstances. Marcus was a young man with a quiet intensity, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much too soon. "John," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with bitterness, "when I heard what happened to you, I knew I couldn't stay silent. They did the same thing to me, same excuses, same vague reasons about not fitting with the company culture. But I knew what it was. They never wanted us there in the first place." John nodded, feeling a familiar pang of recognition. "I didn't want to believe it at first, Marcus. I thought maybe I was just reading too much into things. But when it happened, it became so clear. This wasn't about my work. It was about who I am." Marcus leaned forward, his voice quiet but fierce. "I'm with you, John. Whatever it takes, I'll help. People need to know what's really going on at that place." Over the course of several days, John and Marcus connected with more former employees, each with their own story of mistreatment, subtle biases, and eventual dismissal. Some were hesitant to speak up, fearing backlash, or the impact on future job prospects. But others, empowered by John and Marcus's courage, decided they had been silent long enough. Richard organized a gathering, inviting several former employees, activists, and community leaders to discuss the next steps. The room was filled with people who had once been strangers, but were now united by a shared purpose: to bring justice not just for John, but for everyone who had been affected by the company's practices. During the gathering, Richard took the floor, his voice steady but impassioned. "We're not here just to fight for John. We're here to stand up for every person who's been treated unfairly, who's been told they're not good enough simply because of who they are. Harris Industries represents a system that has been allowed to go unchecked for too long. But we have the power to change that together." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the room with a renewed energy, a shared commitment. This wasn't just John's fight anymore. It was a movement. John looked around, his heart swelling with pride. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, and for the first time, he truly believed that they could make a difference. This battle would not be easy, but he was no longer facing it alone. He had his brother, his friends, and a community ready to stand beside him. As the meeting came to a close, John felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Richard, his expression filled with a quiet pride. "You're doing good, John. This is what change looks like." John nodded, his gaze unwavering. "We're not stopping until we see it through, no matter how long it takes." In the days that followed, John's story spread throughout the city. Local news stations picked up on the movement, community organizations voiced their support, and social media buzzed with calls for accountability and justice. People who had once felt isolated, silenced, began sharing their own experiences, adding fuel to the growing fire. Harris Industries quickly realized the gravity of the situation. Executives scrambled to respond, issuing statements and holding meetings to discuss damage control. David Harris, the manager who had dismissed John, watched in shock as his decision unraveled into a citywide controversy. What he had thought would be a simple, quiet termination had transformed into a public reckoning he never anticipated. But John and Richard remained undeterred. With each passing day, their case grew stronger, their resolve unshaken. And though the road ahead was long, John knew one thing for certain. This was a battle worth fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Together, they had planted the seeds of justice, and now, it was only a matter of time before they would see it bear fruit. David's realization. David Harris sat in his office, the blinds drawn and the room cloaked in an uncomfortable darkness, despite the bright afternoon sun outside. The stack of papers on his desk lay untouched, his usual routine of morning emails and status updates neglected as he scrolled through his phone, his pulse quickening with each headline he read. It had started as a trickle, a single article in the City Sentinel, detailing the abrupt termination of a long-standing employee named John Matthews, a story about unjust dismissal and rumors of discrimination. But by midday, the trickle had turned into a flood. Local news stations had picked up the story, social media was buzzing with outrage, and community leaders were calling for answers. For the first time, David felt a chill of panic gnaw at him. White manager unjustly fires longtime employee. Did racism play a role? Read one headline. Another article questioned, are discriminatory practices rooted in Harris Industries culture? The word struck David like a physical blow. He had been in high-pressure situations before, had dealt with upset employees, and had even navigated minor public relations crises. But this was different. This was personal, and it was spreading like wildfire. As he continued reading, David's heart sank further when he saw John's name paired with another he hadn't expected, Richard Matthews, the city's mayor and John's older brother. How did I not know this? He thought, a wave of nausea twisting his stomach. David had always prided himself on knowing every important detail about his employees, but somehow he had missed the most important one. John Matthews wasn't just a quiet, diligent worker. He was family to one of the city's most influential men. David stood abruptly, pacing the room as the reality of his situation set in. He could see it now, the uproar from the public, the reputation of Harris Industries on the line, the board's eyes fixed squarely on him. There were even whispers from employees about organizing a petition, demanding answers from management, and pushing for a formal investigation. The company he had worked so hard to climb through was now under a microscope, and he was at the center of it all. As his panic grew, David's assistant, Laura, knocked hesitantly on his door, peeking in with a cautious look. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice soft, "the board has requested an emergency meeting with you. They want to discuss the recent events." David forced himself to take a breath, steeling his nerves. He nodded, gesturing for Laura to arrange the meeting, though his mind was spinning. His usual confidence was slipping, and he could feel himself starting to unravel. He had taken John's dismissal for granted, believing it would be nothing more than another HR formality, an exercise of his managerial discretion. But he hadn't foreseen the backlash, and certainly hadn't anticipated that his actions would bring the full weight of the city's scrutiny upon him. As he waited for the board meeting, David reviewed every interaction he'd had with John over the years, looking for any clue that might explain why things had escalated so rapidly. He had always been hard on John, pushing him more than others, never quite satisfied with his work, and he realized now that his expectations had always been subtly biased. John had been a target for David's frustration, his insecurities, even his prejudices, in ways that David hadn't consciously acknowledged until now. The memory of John's face during their final conversation replayed in his mind. The disbelief, the hurt, the barely concealed anger. David realized, with a sinking feeling, that his actions hadn't just cost John a job. They had undermined John's sense of worth, his trust in the system, his faith in hard work paying off. When the meeting finally began, the board members' faces appeared on the screen in a row of stern expressions, each one more grim than the last. The head of the board, Robert Lang, a sharp-eyed man with a no-nonsense demeanor, wasted no time in addressing the issue. "David," Robert began, his voice clipped, "we are receiving an unprecedented amount of backlash because of your decision to fire John Matthews. The public is demanding an explanation, and frankly, so are we. How did you handle this so poorly?" David swallowed, forcing his voice to remain steady as he tried to explain himself. "I made the decision based on performance issues," he replied, attempting to sound confident. John's work had been slipping, and there were complaints. Complaints. One of the board members interjected, her tone incredulous. "From whom?" "We've reviewed John's performance history, and there was no indication of any formal complaints. In fact, his records show a consistent pattern of high-quality work." David hesitated, his mind racing as he tried to maintain his composure. He hadn't expected the board to dig so deeply into John's records. "I may not have documented every concern," he admitted, his voice faltering. "But I assure you, his performance was declining." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Robert leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "David, we are not only dealing with accusations of discrimination, we are dealing with public outcry, a potential lawsuit, and the involvement of the mayor himself. This is no longer just about one employee's dismissal. This is about the reputation of Harris Industries." As the reality of the situation sank in, David felt a wave of dread wash over him. He knew that if the board decided to sacrifice him to protect the company's reputation, his career could be over. And more importantly, he realized that his actions had set off a chain reaction that was now beyond his control. When the meeting ended, David sat alone in his office, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had tried to assert his power, believing he was untouchable, but now he could see how his actions had been misguided, even reckless. He knew he needed to take action, but the damage had been done. John, his brother, and now the public were demanding justice, and David wasn't sure there was any way to fix what he had broken. That night, David lay awake, his mind replaying every decision he had made, every opportunity he had to be fair, to give John a chance, to recognize his dedication. For the first time, David began to see the consequences of his own biases, the harm he had caused not only to John but to everyone in his company who had been watching, learning what it meant to work under someone like him. In the days that followed, Harris Industries faced increasing pressure from both the public and its employees. News outlets ran exposes, community activists called for boycotts, and employees began to speak up about the toxic work culture under David's leadership. Rumors spread about the formation of a workers' union, and whispers of other discriminatory practices started surfacing. David watched as the company he had devoted years to began to fracture, all because of a single fateful decision he had made. One morning, David decided to reach out to John. He knew it was a long shot, that John would likely want nothing to do with him, but he felt compelled to at least attempt to make amends. With a mixture of desperation and genuine remorse, he picked up the phone and dialed John's number. After several rings, he was met with John's voicemail. David left a message, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "John, it's David Harris. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I know it's too little, too late, But I need you to know that I regret what happened. I understand now that I was wrong, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right, if you'll let me." David hung up, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He knew that an apology wouldn't undo the harm he had caused, but it was the first step in facing the consequences of his actions. Whether John would ever forgive him was out of his hands, but he was determined to try to change, to become a better person, even if it took losing everything to realize it. In the following days, the pressure on Harris Industries continued to mount. The company released a statement promising to review its workplace policies, but the public wasn't satisfied with empty promises. The board, desperate to salvage the company's reputation, began taking steps to distance itself from David, hinting at a possible restructuring of leadership. For David, the reckoning was complete. He had underestimated John, underestimated the power of truth, and most of all, underestimated the strength of a community united by a shared sense of justice. As he packed up his office, preparing to leave the company he had once ruled with an iron hand, he realized that he had been his own downfall. For John, Richard, and the community, David's departure was just the beginning of a larger change. They had set out to expose the truth, to fight against a system that had silenced too many voices, and they had won. The seeds of justice they had planted were beginning to take root, and Harris Industries, along with others in the city, would feel the impact for years to come. As David walked out of the building for the last time, he looked back, understanding for the first time the weight of his actions, the lives he had affected, and the lessons he had learned too late. The city would move on, but he would carry this with him, a reminder of the cost of arrogance and the power of justice.